Now today, friends, I come back to 1 Chronicles, the 20th chapter. And we're in this section from chapter 18 through 20, David's wars. And we saw last time, whence come wars? What is the background of war? Well, it comes from individuals, friends. War comes because it's in the human heart, because of the fact of sin. And as long as there is going to be sin in the world, as long as there's evil in the world, there'll be war. As long as there's light and darkness, good and evil, they have to be opposed to each other. Because if they're not, it's not good and evil, and it's not light and darkness. All these are opposed to each other. Now we have seen that that's been illustrated in the life of David. This is further illustrated in this very brief 20th chapter. And we find that there are two enemies. They were the constant, persistent, and seemed to be the eternal enemies of the nation Israel, and especially of David. And one was the Ammonites, and the other were the Philistines. And may I say that there's no such thing as compromise, that there are certain things that have to be fought out. And we're fighting against spiritual wickedness today in the high places. If you're a child of God, you're also a soldier of God. That's the reason we're enjoying put on the armor of God. We're not to march against anyone. We're to stand. Stand, and that is the thing that's important today. If you stand for the things of God, you're in a battle, my friend. You're in a war, whether you like it or not. And the war may cease in Asia and in Africa and Europe and in the Western Hemisphere, but there'll still be war as long as there's evil in the world. Now, will you notice, I begin reading at verse 1. And it came to pass that after the year was expired, at the time that kings go out to battle, Joab led forth the power of the army, wasted the country of the children of Ammon, and came and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem. Joab smote Rabbah and destroyed it. Now, we find here that this seems rather strange, does it not? It looks like Joab was the one that was the aggressor in this particular case. And he may have been, but if you are wanting to blame him, then you've forgotten what we looked at last time. You remember that David made a friendly gesture to the young king of Ammon. The old king died, and David sent his condolences and his sympathy, and he was insulted. And immediately the new king came against David in warfare. And so this is just a continuation of the warfare, my friend. There's no compromise with evil. As long as there's light and darkness, there must be. As long as there's right and wrong just can't agree with each other. The idea today that these two can get along is wrong. How can two walk together except they be agreed? And if you're walking with evil, it's because you've compromised with it. You're in agreement with it. My friend, this is something today the world's forgetting. It's almost, well, it would be amusing if it wasn't so tragic that there's so many people that are horrified at war when it's across the ocean. But when there's lawlessness in our streets, we must learn to understand these folk today. We just must learn to appreciate them. May I say that today there is hypocrisy in our contemporary culture that is sickening beyond degree. And if it's wrong across the ocean, it's wrong here. And evil must be opposed. Lawlessness must be opposed. Has to be. There cannot be right unless wrong is opposed. Now you have here the other persistent enemy of Israel and of David, the Philistines. Verse 4, it came to pass after this that there arose war at Gezer with the Philistines. And we are told that the children of the giant were subdued. You remember this was the place where David had slain the giant. But now we find that the children of the giant are also slain. They were a constant enemy of the children of Israel. That is the message, I think, in this chapter here for you and me today. Now we change the subject altogether. When we come to chapter 21, David's sin in numbering the people. And all the way through here, I've called your attention to the fact that in Chronicles, we get God's perspective rather than man's, while in the two books of Samuel and Kings, we get man's perspective, man's viewpoint. Now we get God's viewpoint. Now back in 2 Samuel, the 24th chapter, why we saw something about David's sin and numbering the people. But there was, very frankly, a little confusion in our hearts and minds. Why was that a sin? And we made a suggestion or two then. But now, from God's viewpoint, we find out why it was a sin. And we now get God's estimate. Before it was man's estimate. And before it was the political side. Now we get the spiritual side. And we find here that we have an explanation of David's sin. Now, we are told back in 1 Samuel, we see David acting independently, and Israel sinned, and God permitted David to be the instrument. But there's something else here. Notice verse 1 of chapter 21. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. Now we have found the culprit here. This was satanic. Satan was back of this. Now this throws light upon David's great sin. You notice that it's not in Chronicles here, blot out my transgressions, my iniquities. That was his sin with Bathsheba. But here, Satan was back of David's sin. And I think there's something else that we need to consider here. And the question is, again, why was it a sin for David to number the children of Israel? Why was that a sin?